Is Apple's new iPad Pro really the world's best new computer?
And is the new MacBook Air worth the asking price?
Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.
Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined by a man who didn't stay up all night to get lucky, or indeed cover an Apple press conference, the lucky sod, Adam Turner, as we go behind the headlines in search of the big picture. This week, we're firing up the trusty old Vertical Hold satellite to cross over to New York, where Fairfax technology writer Peter Wells is standing by. Welcome back to the show, Pete.
Oh, thanks for having me, boys.
Now, Apple's in headline-grabbing mode, having just concluded its More in the Making event, where it showed off a whole range of new Macs and iPad Pro lines. So we're going to dive straight into the Apple action, and we may as well start, as Apple did, with the new MacBook Airs. It's been a while since they've refreshed the MacBook Airs in such a significant way, hasn't it, Pete?
Yeah. So they did do a really modest speed bump in 2017, but that wasn't really worth talking about. If you want to talk about the last time the MacBook Air got some love, proper love, in terms of an upgrade, that was 2015. So yeah, it's been quite some time since we saw any new features coming to the MacBook Air, which was a laptop that I loved. You know, Tim got on stage this morning and said that it was the most beloved notebook of all time. And I held on to mine for 5 years, which was 2 years longer than we were supposed to at my work. And I was having my manager every other week telling me I had to throw it out or at least recycle it and get a new a device that was actually under warranty. But I loved that machine so much, I didn't want to let it go.
Yeah, I mean, they had great durability. I had one for a good long time until it literally died the death. And my lame claim to fame is that I was physically in the audience for when Steve Jobs did the whole envelope pull thing, which they actually referenced this morning. But these are pretty different MacBook Airs to those original models, aren't they?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see that as Apple almost abandoned the MacBook Air design, everyone else took it to heart. You know, we saw, I think the Dell XPS has been a beautiful MacBook Air successor for the last couple of years. And if that thing ran Mac OS, then that would have been my daily driver. It's a really gorgeous machine. And I kept kind of comparing my memory of the XPS to the Air, and I can't wait to actually, get a proper review unit and look at them side by side, because I feel that a lot of what we've seen here is kind of Apple kind of catching up to people who were catching up to them a couple of years ago. So it's a very funny, bizarre little industry.
They're not getting any cheaper though, are they? There was a time where the MacBook Air also sort of stacked up well price-wise, which you could say about a lot of Apple gear. But as this stuff gets more expensive, does it kind of defeat the purpose, or do they, just Apple fans will hand over the cash?
I don't know. I mean, so I was looking at that pricing, and I think so. The MacBook Air for the longest time was $999 in US dollars. When it first came out, it was far, far more expensive. But yeah, $999 was kind of where it sat for the longest time. This new Air has been bumped up to $1,199, so it's only $200 more expensive, which I guess you can argue is for the Retina and the Touch ID, and all of that kind of stuff that's involved. It's just when you do the conversion into Australian dollars that it really starts to hurt. So we're looking at about $1,800 for the Air in Australia. But then again, like I keep coming back to the Dell XPS, that would be the laptop I would buy over this. And you can get the entry level XPS is about $1,700. There are different trade-offs. So that version has a 1080p screen, which is probably going to be fine for most people. And it has a much bigger SSD. So yeah, depending on kind of where you see your priorities, but there's nothing exactly, like for like in terms of the XPS versus this new Air. But it's more how badly our dollar is doing, and then you have to add on the sales tax and everything else, and then you end up it doesn't look as bad, but yeah, it's still a lot.
I think it muddies the picture though as well though, because the MacBook Pro pricing for a 13-inch MacBook Pro is pretty similar as well. And you start to get into that position of is thin enough to sell is thin and the Retina display, and in some ways that's just Apple catching up with itself as well, because obviously we've had Retina display Macs for a while now. Is that enough to and I suppose the new colors, is that enough to sell it?
I think the two USB, it's got a terrible name. It's something like the non-touch bar 13-inch MacBook Air. MacBook Pro.
Yeah, death to the touch bar. Did I say that out loud?
We'll get to that. But yeah, the version that... So if you want a touch bar Mac, then you pay a hell of a lot more than this. But the one that is comparable is the MacBook Pro without a touch bar. I can't see that getting any further upgrades. It didn't get an upgrade earlier this year when the other MacBook Pros did. So it's still running the older processor inside. I think that it's just kind of hanging around because they have stock. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't the best-selling MacBook of all time. So maybe it's just going to stick around until after Christmas, and then it will suddenly not be on the site anymore. But I think this is basically like that. Always felt like the MacBook Air because they weren't making a MacBook Air. What's more interesting, I think, is the MacBook, which is closer, just to make the naming convention very confusing. It's the new MacBook, the tiny, super thin one, is kind of closer to that original one that they pulled out of the envelope all those years ago, in the sense that it doesn't have that much power and it's bloody expensive. Whereas the second generation MacBook Air was actually the one that most people know and love, which is the one that actually had SSD, and it was fairly decently priced and a very well-spec'd machine.
Yeah, I mean, with Apple's general insistence on talking about kind of experiences rather than specifications, I think it's a kind of confusing time to be buying a new MacBook computer, because you've got so many machines that at broadly similar price points, and you're right that some of them are probably at their end of their processor life. But I think it's a bit of a tough decision thing. Although there is, as I alluded to before, the whole Malibu Stacey's new hat, because you can now get it in new colors.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a turning point. I definitely think that the lineup has been ridiculously confused for the last couple of years. I've a few years ago, it was so simple to say if someone asked me what laptop they should get, and I've worked in retail for Apple centers. I've worked as support for a very large organization, and when those questions would come up, my answer was always get the Air unless you really need the Pro, and that was fine and really good advice for many years. And then the last couple of years has been, well, if you need 4 USB, you should get this, but then you have to pay the touch bar tax, and then I don't know, it became so hard to answer that question. And I'm hoping that once the product lines, once the touch bar, the non-touch bar MacBook Pro finally disappears from the site, I think we will get back to the point where it becomes that simple discussion again of get the Air unless you need the Pro.
While the prices are going up, it's clearly not as out of control as iPhone pricing. Is that just because Apple's a bit more constrained by what else you can get for the money when you're buying a notebook, as opposed to the iPhone space where they kind of consider that, well, there's nothing compares to the iPhone, so we'll charge whatever the hell we want?
I guess, but, I mean, their prices, again, are pretty similar to the Note and the Galaxy S9. So,
yeah,
Apple, as Samsung, are quite happy
Which
to
iPhones
say...
are you buying? I mean, sorry, the XS Max is in a class of its own, and a high-spec XS is well and above the Note 9, the highest spec Note 9 you can buy. I'm sorry to interject, but that's not a comparison that stacks up at a financial level.
If I didn't have one of the older style MacBook Pros in front of me that has a very clacky keyboard, I would Google it right now. But unfortunately, it would just be too painful for your listeners. So I'm pretty confident that the pricing is not that bad when it comes to the very high-end Samsung devices versus the very high-end iPhones. Now, of course, the XS Max is a thing I would never even consider. And right now I'm rocking the X they're 10. They're 10 people. The 10R, and I think that is actually the one that anyone should get. In the same way that I used to say the Air was the one anyone should get. Like the 10R is without a doubt the best bang for buck in their phone lineup. I think the XS and the XS Max are there for people who will pay that premium for Apple gear.
And then what's the best bang for your buck coming back to the MacBooks? What's the sweet spot, you think?
Well, it's too hard to say. Like right now, I think it's very hard to say without doing a proper review on the Air, but I was very pleased with what I saw. It was interesting to see what was, like, the screen was absolutely gorgeous, as you would expect. Like they've been doing this for a while. But, there were certain keywords that I've heard them say about previous products that weren't said today. Now that just, for most people, I think, again, they would look at it and go, well, that's a bloody nice screen. And that's where most people are going to like. They may not need the P3 color gamut or whatever else that stepping up to the MacBook Pro would give you. But again, that would come at a cost. So I'm hoping that next year's model, we're already looking ahead. The event is, just a few hours ago, but hopefully this new model means that next year's model can be a little bit cheaper once they've got the MacBook Airs flying off the production line. And then we're back into that kind of cadence where, yep, you've got the Air that comes out every 2 years and it's good enough for most people. And here's the Pro for you people who need to edit, 8K video on the road.
Now, speaking of good enough for most people, I know one of the things they announced was something you were particularly keen on because they finally updated the Mac Mini.
Yeah, so the Mini
it's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, so that one was October 2014 was the last time it got an upgrade. So 4 years ago, quite some time. And again, that update was not a hell of an update. So it was great to see the Mac Mini get some love. We use them at work quite a bit as servers, and just I know a lot of people have used them in the past as media servers. They're great little machines for that. But it was really interesting actually to see. I assume with your audience I can nerd out just a tad.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, it was really interesting to see. So previously, the MacBook. The very first Mac Mini, was basically a MacBook Air that had been cut in half and folded over onto itself. Like if you looked at the logic board, it was the exact same logic board.
It knows what it did.
Yeah, and so and that was basically what the Mac Mini was for a very long time. Even when it changed its shape and design, it was basically the internals of the MacBook Air stuck into this machine. I thought that one of the reasons why the Mini had not been updated for so long was because the Air hadn't been updated for so long. So they just weren't making that logic board. But they really have done a kind of complete redesign of the internals, which has allowed them to up the thermal kind of limit on this new Mac Mini, which means that for the first time ever, the Mac Mini is actually running desktop spec'd processors and RAM and all of that good stuff. So, it was interesting to see in some of the demo areas, the Mac Mini was being used for pretty high-end stuff. We're talking like video editing. Then I moved to one desk and they actually had a stack of 5 Mac Minis together that they turned into a tiny little desktop render farm that they were spitting out video from one Mac Mini, and it was just being rendered across 5 Minis at the same time and spitting it out. It was incredible to see. So these are little things that that I would never expect to see a Mini being used that way, and I don't expect that to be the Mini's main role. I think this Mini would be very, very, a very good thing to pop into, say, higher education labs. So multi-user kind of spaces, things like corporate hot desks. I reckon the Mini would go very well in those kind of areas as well. And then, of course, your nerds who want to have a full version of Mac OS sitting under their TV as well. So, I think it was like, again, I'm sure this is one of the reasons it probably has not gotten an update in so long is like those use cases are kind of not sexy in any way. They're not interesting. They're not in the kind of thing that Apple can make beautiful posters about. But for the people who love the Mini, they love the Mini. And so it was good to see that it got some love as well.
But the Mini's got a $12.50 price tag, I think, in Australia, which does make it a bit expensive for some of those solutions. I remember a time when a Mini was well south.
Because I was just about to say, curiously, and Apple hates this word, it's the cheapest of the Macs.
It's the cheapest of the Macs, but it's still expensive for a Mac Mini. There was a time when I remember you could pick up a Mac Mini for, I want to say $800 or something like that. I might be thinking, 6 or 7 years ago. And it really made a lot of sense as a media center, especially back when other media center solutions were so clunky. But now I think it would be a big ask to pay $12.50 to put a Mac Mini in your lounge room as a home theater PC, considering that the set-top boxes that are around these days do such a great job. And most of what you want to watch is, Netflix, Stan, Amazon Prime Video, catch-up TV.
Madness. Absolutely.
Yeah. You get yourself a Chromecast, get yourself a Telstra TV, and they will do a fantastic job at a fraction of the price. And I actually used to annoy me that...
Not so sure about the Telstra TV there, but of course, if you want to stay on
maybe
brand,
not the Telstra TV,
you could get an Apple TV, of course.
And that's actually, even an Apple TV
there.
Yeah,
I don't expect it to be slotting into people's home theater systems. I'd say it's more, if you have a Plex server or some kind of media server, or even the need to have a server of some kind of home office server, for instance, that's where the Mac Mini might be something you would look at. Again, I'm not saying I need one. I'm not going to replace my current solution. And if you're rocking a Raspberry Pi or you're rocking a Intel NUC and it's doing the job for you, of course, like there's no need to get this. But there are people who will find, and that's what I mean about it being such a kind of very narrow use case. But there are people out there who will find that use case for it and will be very happy that their 2012 Mac Mini that has had one too many scary kernel panics over the last year or so, it can finally be put to rest.
Now, you mentioned the Mac Mini not being particularly sexy, except to a particular group of fetishists, so we say. But Apple did have its sexy product to unveil, which is, of course, the new iPad Pro. And there's quite a few big changes there, starting, of course, with the incredibly heavily leaked, it's got Face ID, not Touch ID. Is this as much of a game changer as Apple seems to think it is?
I think it is in the sense of what it means for the rest of the device. Steve, way back in the day, Steve used to always complain about buttons on his devices. And I think, wherever he is right now, I'm sure he'd be very happy to know the iPad has finally lost one of its major buttons because he really loved the iPad more than any other, device in the lineup. So, I think this is, the first thing that does is it allows you to kind of just move the iPad and hold it whichever way and not actually care kind of which angle it's being held at. Now, Face ID, do you like Face ID? I personally think it's pretty damn good. It works way better in an indoor environment. The only time I've ever had issues is kind of when I'm walking around in direct sunlight, which is probably not something I'm going to do on the iPad. So I think it's going to work pretty damn well on the iPad.
It makes me wonder if there isn't a bigger security issue here. Like, one of the things they announced is that it will work in portrait or landscape or if it's on the keyboard. But this presumably means that actually an iPad Pro is going to spend an awful lot of its time, if you're near it, unlocked because it's going to be able to see you. And for a phone that you're holding, that's maybe not so much of an issue. For something that, according to Tim Cook, is the world's most popular computer, although I'm sure he was pushing a whole bunch of iPad sales in those numbers. But for something that's meant to be a productivity computer, certainly, I would be concerned, well, hang on, if this is going to be unlocked, someone swipes it and, relatively quickly swipes up so it is actually accessible. And they've got access to my documents, a fair bit faster than I might be able to log in and lock it back down again.
I guess, but the iPhone right now has the attention setting, so you can actually have the Face ID only unlock if you're giving it your attention, and that works really well. So if you've tested that on a phone and you look away for a second, the phone is completely locked again, waiting for you to kind of make eye contact again. I would imagine the iPad does the same.
I'd hope so, and I suppose it depends on whether or not you toggle that on or off. Now, the other thing, actually, of course, is that this is running a souped-up version of the A12 Bionic that they threw into the new iPhones. And I find that kind of fascinating because my own observations, and you may think differently, of course, were that the A12 Bionic's a great chip, don't get me wrong, but it almost feels like too much of an engine for that phone. It's not really doing much with that yet, and maybe that will come, but right now it's too big an engine. For the iPad Pro, that feels like it should make more sense because you're meant to multitask. You're meant to push it harder.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are so many times when you hear those specs that Apple say during iPhone announcements where it's like, I mean, that's great, that's impressive, but like, do I really need a phone that is, faster than the iMac Pro that you sell for $7,000 for Twitter, for browsing Twitter or for whatever it is that I do on my phone most of the time, or Candy Crush, like I'm sure a lot of people kind of see those numbers and think, yeah, great, but why? If you are the kind of person, if you are the kind of person that does spend a lot of time in these devices, and I've got a friend, so it was really interesting tonight. First of all, because of the fact that it was an East Coast event, meant that more Australians were up than previous Apple events that I've seen. But one of my friends who was up is a professional photographer, and he's been waiting basically to get rid of his MacBook Pro for a long time. So he's used an iMac on his desk, and that's where the grunt of his kind of Lightroom work happens. But he does need a device that is kind of a monitor device while he's on shoots. And yeah, he was like blown away by what he saw on the iPad. So I think one of the demos that they did was a Photoshop document with 175 layers. That will, I mean, a Photoshop document with like 20 layers will like grind many PCs to a halt. And I got to play with one of those in the demo section later, and it's crazy. Like it is crazy the amount of power in there, and it's really odd too because when we don't know the numbers because Apple never tell you the numbers about all the other components in there. But of course, the day these things go on sale, iFixit or someone's going to tear them down and say there's only 4 gig of RAM or 6 gig of RAM or whatever it's going to be inside. And that's the bit that is actually the stuff that makes my head explode, because it's when you see the responsiveness of those pixels when you've got something like Procreate or Affinity Designer and you're just flying through layers of stuff and making changes on the fly and it all just kind of is happening. That is bizarre. Like how they pull that off. Like I understand the A12 is hella fast to use a technical term, listeners. But I just don't understand how it all kind of fits in together as the one package.
Did they show off any augmented reality?
Of course they did.
Because that's one of the things they're talking about for justifying the need for all that grunt. Did they show anything that beyond what we've seen before that would justify that kind of grunt?
As true as night turns into day, you sit through an AR demo at a Apple event. It's you always get AR, and look, at least it's not VR. I'm sure it.
You don't want to strap an iPad Pro to your face? That'd look great.
No, look, to be fair, I do think, first of all, I think AR makes terrible demos. Like, it always looks jittery because you're seeing it through the person's hands. So it always just kind of makes me sick a little bit. But anyway, I would say that AR makes a hell of a lot more sense than VR. And look, I've used the AR a little bit now, actually, where we were seeing, we were doing some renovations to our garden, and I thought, oh yeah, God, I've sat through so many AR demonstrations. I may as well use it. And I measured up our backyard, and it ended up being like spot on. So, sure, a $1 measuring tape probably could have done the same thing, but who has one of those?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about AR on an iPad as well, just because the physical form factor of holding this thing up versus holding a phone up.
Yeah.
It's quite a different experience. This is not a super heavy thing,
no,
but it's quite different to hold an 11-inch tablet up as opposed to holding up a much smaller iPhone or indeed Android device, because there's plenty of AR there, including measuring as well.
Yeah, actually, I've got to say that they do feel a hell of a lot lighter. They're only a little bit lighter, but they feel a lot lighter, especially with the new. I think the best in show was the smart connector keyboard, or whatever they call it. It doesn't have the kind of trifold anymore. It just folds really nice and flush against the device, and I always felt it was like kind of unseemly and a bit floppy the previous version. So for it to be, just this beautiful, nice kind of, it finally feels, as good as Microsoft's Surface type cover keyboard. Like, when you buy a Surface and you buy one of those, they feel like they should be together. Like it feels bizarre to not buy one without the other. And that's what this felt like for the first time. And it just felt really, really solid. Something that, it was definitely a great improvement.
Yeah, I mean, it'd want to be for the price they're asking for it. And indeed, the new iPad Pros themselves can get pretty frighteningly expensive as well. The elephant in the room here, though, and the thing that really fascinated me was that, again, as widely rumoured, they've gone for USB-C. Is this the death knell for Lightning connectors?
I don't think so. Unfortunately, I would be more. Actually, I was going to say I'd probably be more expecting to see Lightning just go, and then you do everything wirelessly with the phone, and that's probably. I'd say that would be a better bet than expecting USB-C to come to the iPhone. I think that they prefer how much smaller the Lightning is for a device like the iPhone, and eventually they'll want it. It will be too big for them, and they'll just will go totally wireless. But when we go to the iPad, I'm glad they did it, because I called USB-C an own goal by Apple when I was reviewing the latest MacBooks, just because I think. I was all in on USB-C when I first heard about the spec, and I was happy to for Apple to rip USB-A from my cold dead hands. But by not moving the iPhone and the iPad to USB-C, then they were putting me, as someone who owns all of their devices, in a really weird spot. Whereas, if I bought any of the latest Android phones, I would have been able to charge that phone with the thing that charges my laptop. It made no sense. So I'm glad to see USB-C at least coming to one of their other products, which is the iPad Pro. But it also just gives them a lot more flexibility with that port. So I saw on one demo, I got to edit a movie in iMovie. And I had the timeline filling up the screen of the iPad, and then the external monitor that was plugged in via USB was just showing the final footage as I was editing it, which is a really lovely workflow to have as a video editor. There was another demo where they were ingesting footage from a DSLR, and it was just lightning fast watching the footage come through. Now, I still think that there are software limitations to really getting the best out of that USB-C port, but I think that that's the way kind of Apple roll. That they'll introduce the hardware first, and then hopefully we'll see some interesting new software developments. I also think that as I've tried to use the iPad as my main laptop, there's still one or two. Like, I think the multitasking improvements have been great that came in with iOS 11, I believe. But I think that there's still quite a bit to go. The main one that I keep thinking and keep coming back to with Apple people when I speak to them is it's great that I can have Gmail and Safari side by side on my laptop and get some work done that way. What I really need is Gmail and Gmail side by side on my on my screen, so that I can be writing an email in one side of the screen while referring to the emails in the other.
Yeah, weirdly, there are some Android implementations that let you do that kind of app cloning, but Apple doesn't seem interested. And I guess you're right. It'll come down to, in a sense, what Apple allows people to do with USB-C, because you could open up a whole bunch of use cases, but obviously you've got to have an app that then talks to things in the way that Apple wants it to. I wonder as well what it means for the whole, made for iPad or MFI generally actually made for iOS, certification thing. If I was a third-party device manufacturer, heavily invested in Lightning, I might, and especially Lightning for iPads, I might be a little bit irked.
I guess so, but if you look at the Lightning peripheral market, like specifically for the stuff like spitting out video or adding a second HDMI or whatever it was, they're all pretty terrible. So for them to go away and for it to mean that I only have one.
It's no loss. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah. And I guess if you're a MacBook owner already, you've already got a bag full of dongles. So it's nice to only have the one set of dongles that you need from now on.
Okay, so to wrap this up, and I think I know what Pete's answer is going to be, but if we each had, say, $3,000 to spend on new Apple gear, and it had to be on the new Apple gear, what would we buy and why? So, Pete, you go first.
11-inch iPad Pro with the smart connector keyboard, and if you will use it, then the pencil as well.
I honestly thought you were going to say the Mac Mini there. I'm surprised. Adam, what's taken your fancy?
I don't know about any of the new ones. I would just get myself a new MacBook Pro because this one is getting way too old. But I'm a tight ass, and I don't think I need a Retina display. So whatever the cheapest MacBook Pro is.
Fair enough. For my part, yeah, I'm intrigued by the iPad Pro, but I'd probably try and match up a Mac Mini with one of the cheaper iPad Pro 11s. I think I can just do that under $3,000 off the top of my head, maybe. And then I'd just mug Pete and steal his keyboard.
And I'm going to say though, I mean the iPad without Pro on the end of its name, that again is like 90% of people should buy that one instead. It's $300 versus I think $399 versus
That's a great call, yeah.
$1,100, and it is fantastic. Like that screen is so good.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Pete for joining us for the show.
Thank you, boys.
Now, as always, we love to get your feedback on the show. So if you think Apple's really hit it out of the park or they've priced themselves to oblivion, let us know via Twitter or the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
Thanks everyone for listening. And if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button. Tell your friends, get them to hit the subscribe button and leave us a review.
Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.
There was, another demo where they were just sucking off, Can I start that again?